She was the town librarian, quiet, gentle, always with a book in her hand, and her heart hidden behind those shy smiles. Her life was small, simple, and safe. She drank tea instead of wine, wrote poetry in secret, and lived like love was something that only happened to other people. Until the day a man walked into her library, a man who didn't belong there. Henry Westfield, a brilliant, wealthy surgeon from New York City, had come to escape everything: pressure, power, and people who only loved his name. But in Grace, he found something real. And in loving her, he would risk his entire world. This is their story, a quiet beginning that turned into a love that shook a town and melted hearts. Grace Thompson's world was made of whispers, whispers of turning pages. The wind rustling through trees outside the tall arched windows, and her own thoughts, soft as snowfall. She lived in a tiny cottage just 3 blocks from the Elmridge Town Library. The house was small, tucked behind a white picket fence that leaned slightly with age, but to her it was a castle. Inside, the smell of lavender and old paper comforted her more than any hug ever had. Each morning, before most of the town had even brewed their coffee, Grace would slip into a faded wool coat and walk the quiet path to the library, her boots crunching softly on gravel. She loved the silence of early mornings. It was the only time the world felt calm enough to hear her. The library itself was a forgotten gem. Built in the 1800s, it had a weathered red brick exterior, tall Gothic windows, and a grand oak door that creaked dramatically each time it opened. It was like a church for stories. Grace was its keeper. She would arrive just after sunrise, unlock the iron gate, and step inside with a quiet reverence, as if not to wake the characters sleeping between the shelves. She would breathe in deeply the scent of ink, leather, and time itself filling her lungs. Then she'd begin her ritual, dusting the shelves, straightening books by touch more than sight, and lighting the small lamps that cast golden halos in every reading corner. Though she was only in her late 20s, Grace had the soul of someone who had lived 100 lives, all of them found in novels. She rarely spoke above a whisper. She kept her dark brown hair in a loose, tidy bun and wore modest cardigans, long skirts, and soft leather shoes that made no sound. People said she was a little odd, too quiet, too serious. But Grace didn't mind, because while others talked of weekend plans and gossip, she was falling in love with characters who'd fought dragons, crossed oceans, and rescued each other with words alone. Yet behind her bookish shyness lived a spark, a soft, flickering flame, almost invisible to the world, but powerful enough to light a universe, if only someone looked closely. She dreamed of a love like the ones she shelved daily, the kind that was slow and sacred, the kind that didn't come wrapped in charm and grand gestures, but in shared silences and small, knowing glances. Still, she believed that kind of love was only for the stories. People didn't fall for shy librarians with ink-stained fingers and thrifted dresses. They fell for bold, beautiful, social women with loud laughs and perfect hair. So Grace stayed in her cocoon, safe, small, and unnoticed. But the universe had other plans. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky was gray and heavy with snow. The library had been especially quiet that day. Only the occasional cough from the history section and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Grace was reshelving a stack of poetry books when the library door opened. It didn't creak like usual. Instead, it let out a soft groan, as if sensing someone different had stepped inside. She glanced up, more out of habit than curiosity, and her breath caught. He stood there like he'd walked out of a novel. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long black coat dusted with snow. His hair was dark and slightly tousled from the wind. His face looked both tired and kind, with piercing eyes that seemed to search the room for something he hadn't yet found. Grace quickly looked down, pretending to be engrossed in a shelf of Emily Dickinson. She heard the footsteps, confident but unhurried, approaching the front desk. "Excuse me," a deep voice said, gentle but firm. She turned slowly, her heart tapping an unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. "Yes?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, not a full smile. Just the corners of his lips lifting, like he didn't do it often, and wasn't sure he still remembered how. "I'm looking for a book," he said. "Aren't we all?" she replied before she could stop herself. He blinked, then chuckled. "That's fair." She blushed instantly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, regretting the comment. But when she met his eyes again, there was no judgment, just curiosity and warmth. "I'm new in town," he continued. "Just moved here last week. I'm a doctor, cardiothoracic surgery, actually. I needed some quiet, so here I am." Grace's fingers tightened slightly around the book in her hand. "A doctor? Here? In sleepy Elmridge? What kind of book are you looking for?" she asked. "Something old. Something with heart." The words hung in the air. She turned and walked toward the historical section, hoping he didn't notice the pink rising in her cheeks. He followed, his footsteps matching hers. For the first time in years, Grace felt aware of every breath she took. She handed him a book on 19th century medicine, her hand brushing his for just a moment. A jolt ran through her, not like lightning, but like warmth blooming beneath her skin. "Thank you," he said, eyes locking with hers for half a second longer than necessary. "You're welcome," she replied, holding his gaze just long enough to wonder who he was. Really? He left with the book tucked under his arm. She watched from the window as he disappeared down the snowy path. Grace didn't know it yet, but that moment, those quiet 30 seconds, had cracked something open inside her. A door she had locked long ago, a dream she had folded up and hidden between the pages of a forgotten book. She touched her lips, then her chest, feeling the flutter of something she thought she'd buried. She didn't even know his name yet, but her story had just begun. Henry Westfield had spent his entire life surrounded by noise. The clinking of wine glasses in grand banquet halls, the cold echo of elevators in high-rise hospitals, the polite laughter of people who didn't know him but wanted something from him. To the world, Henry was a miracle worker, a gifted heart surgeon, a Westfield heir, the youngest to ever lead a surgical team at Westfield Medical Tower in Manhattan. The face on magazine covers, the name whispered in elite social circles. But to himself, he was a man growing hollow. The praise no longer thrilled him. The money no longer motivated him. The parties, the women, the spotlight, they blurred into one meaningless fog. Because underneath the expensive suits and clinical precision was a man carrying wounds no scalpel could heal. His childhood had been scripted, every step planned: prep school, Ivy League, med school, surgical fellowship, inheritance, all handed to him with a smile that demanded perfection. But no one asked what he wanted, and what haunted Henry most was that with all his power to mend broken hearts, he hadn't figured out how to heal his own. He'd lost patience. He'd seen children die on operating tables. He'd been told to stay calm while holding shattered lives in his hands. He was supposed to be made of steel, but he wasn't. After a complicated surgery left a little girl brain dead and the media blamed him, Henry reached a breaking point. One sleepless night, after staring at his reflection for too long in a marble bathroom he didn't care for, Henry Westfield packed a single suitcase and walked out of the life built for him. No press release, no goodbye gala, just silence. He chose Vermont because it was the opposite of everything he knew. Quiet, small, honest. He bought an old cottage near the river and began fixing it up with his own hands. No staff, no drivers. Just cold air and sore muscles and the relief of realness. He spent days planning a community heart clinic. He wanted to offer care without cost, something his family would call foolish. But he didn't care anymore. He wasn't chasing applause. He was chasing peace. Then came that snowy Tuesday. Henry had been organizing some old textbooks at home when he realized he needed something specific, medical papers from the 1800s that had inspired modern cardiac techniques. Someone in town had mentioned the library. He didn't expect much, maybe a dusty shelf and an old woman with reading glasses. What he found instead was her. He stepped through the heavy oak doors and into the warm hush of the Elmridge Library. Soft lamps glowed from behind rows of ancient books. Dust particles floated in the air like slow-moving snowflakes. It felt like walking into a dream. Then he saw her, At the front desk, a young woman sat quietly, flipping through a handwritten ledger. She had a presence like morning light, gentle, golden, and impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Her cardigan was slightly oversized, her hair pinned in a simple twist. She looked up, and for a split second, her eyes met his. Behind those thin glasses, her eyes were a pale shade of hazel. Not the loud kind that demanded attention, the quiet kind that stayed with you. Something tugged at Henry's chest. Not attraction, not right away. Something deeper. Recognition. Like he'd found the last page of a book he hadn't realized he was reading. She looked down again, cheeks coloring softly, as if even eye contact felt too loud. But her presence, it calmed something inside him. He walked slowly to the desk. "Excuse me," he said, his voice softer than usual. She glanced up. "Yes?" Her voice was barely audible, but he heard it like a note played on a violin string, gentle and vibrating in his bones. "I'm looking for a book on early heart surgery, 19th century, maybe earlier." She blinked, surprised by the request, but she didn't ask why. Instead, she stood quietly and gestured for him to follow. He did. They moved through the aisles, shoes whispering against the old wooden floor. She stopped in front of a high shelf and pulled out a worn book with a green leather spine. "This might help," she said. Their fingers brushed as she handed it to him. It lasted less than a second, but Henry felt something strange. Not sparks, not fire, warmth, real, unfamiliar warmth. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and gave the faintest smile, then turned away, her hair falling slightly loose from its pin. Henry stood still for a moment, holding the book like it contained something more than history. When he left the library, snow had started falling. Tiny flakes danced under the streetlights. He didn't know her name. She hadn't asked his, but her face stayed with him the whole way home. That night, Henry didn't open the medical text. Instead, he sat beside the fire, staring into the flames, feeling, for the first time in a long time, curious. Not about surgery, not about money, but about the shy librarian with the quiet spark, who somehow, in 10 silent minutes, made his heart begin to ache in a whole new way. Henry Westfield was becoming a regular at the Elmridge Library. He arrived with the quiet footsteps of someone who didn't want to disturb the peace. But Grace always heard him coming. Sometimes he checked out old medical books, other times poetry. Once he borrowed a weathered volume on Norse mythology and joked that even Vikings probably needed heart surgery. Grace had laughed, softly, like the rustle of pages, and that sound stuck in Henry's memory more than any medical textbook ever had. They spoke in gentle exchanges, never long, never loud. Grace would ask, "How's the clinic coming along?" Henry would shrug, smile, one heartbeat at a time. Soon their conversations moved beyond books and medicine. They began talking about the little things, like the way the rain smelled just before it fell, or how autumn in Vermont made the trees look like fire and gold. Grace confessed she loved thunderstorms. Henry admitted he once fell asleep in a hospital stairwell and dreamed he was walking through a field of lavender. "I haven't told anyone that," he said, almost surprised at himself. "I won't tell," she whispered, and she never did. In those quiet weeks, something strange and beautiful began to grow. Not a romance filled with dramatic gestures or stolen kisses, but something deeper. Every time Henry walked into the library, Grace felt it in her chest, like the flutter of a bird that didn't want to fly away. She'd look up from her desk and see his figure silhouetted in the golden afternoon light, and suddenly the room felt warmer. Henry, too, began to change. The sharpness in his eyes softened. The lines of exhaustion slowly faded from his face. He smiled more, real smiles that reached his eyes. People in town started to notice a new light in the doctor's step, but he never mentioned Grace, because what they shared wasn't for display. It was something sacred. An understanding passed between glances and silences. They started taking walks. Every Thursday evening, just before the library closed, Henry would appear with 2 cups of coffee from the cafe across the street. They'd sit on the old wooden bench near the rose bushes, sipping in silence. Sometimes they spoke of stars. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. One night after the first snowfall, they sat beneath a bare maple tree. The sky was velvet black, and the stars shimmered like they were leaning in to listen. Henry looked at her, his breath visible in the cold air. "You know," he said slowly, "you're the only person who speaks to my soul without using a single word." Grace didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was thick with emotion. But she looked at him, really looked, and in her eyes he found the answer. They never kissed, not yet, but love was already blooming. Quiet, rooted, unshakable. It was a love built on trust, on stillness, on being seen without performance. Henry once left a small pressed flower in a book she was reading. She once left a folded paper crane on his table at the clinic. They never talked about these little gestures. They didn't have to, but for all its beauty, their love wasn't protected from the storm brewing in the background. Henry's phone buzzed more often. Calls from New York, messages from family. His mother emailed daily, asking why he wasn't answering reporters. His father demanded he attend a foundation gala. There were whispers of board meetings, inheritance discussions, reputation risks. But Henry had stopped caring about appearances. What he hadn't stopped caring about was Grace, and that made everything more complicated, because the deeper he fell, the more he feared what the truth might cost them both. Grace, on the other hand, began to wonder, why him? Why would a man like Henry Westfield, a surgeon, a millionaire, a Westfield legacy, want her? A quiet librarian with secondhand sweaters and a scar on her heart no one ever bothered to ask about. She couldn't understand it, and part of her didn't trust it, but she couldn't stop the way her heart lit up when he walked into the room, or the way her hands trembled slightly when they almost touched. They never defined what was happening between them. There were no labels, no confessions, only glances, only gestures, only that steady, unfolding warmth. But love, real love, can't stay hidden forever. It demands to be chosen. And just as the air between them grew thick with the unspoken, the storm they'd both been ignoring began to thunder on the horizon. Not from strangers, but from within. Henry would have to choose the legacy written in his last name, or the quiet librarian who had rewritten his heart. And Grace, she would have to believe, for the first time in her life, that she was worthy of being someone's miracle. Even a millionaire's. Even Henry's. There comes a time in every love story when silence is no longer enough. When stolen glances and quiet nights can't protect you from the world outside. Henry and Grace had reached that moment. Their hearts had already chosen, but the world, it hadn't caught up. Henry Westfield had spent his life walking a tightrope between the man he was groomed to be and the man he actually was. His family, the Westfields, were a dynasty. Old money, big expectations, even bigger judgments. They didn't speak with emotion. They spoke with influence. Dinner conversations were negotiations. Holidays were photo ops. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliances. And Grace? Grace was everything they wouldn't understand. She didn't come from legacy or country clubs. She didn't know the rules of ballroom etiquette. She didn't own designer handbags or sip champagne in rooftop lounges. She wore secondhand cardigans. She loved stray cats. She read poetry by candlelight when the power went out. And she came from a mixed heritage that the Westfields would call complicated. It wasn't that Grace was ashamed of who she was. Far from it. She had a quiet pride, woven from her grandparents' lullabies and her mother's strength. She had a history in her veins that taught her how to endure, how to stay kind in the face of cruelty. But Henry knew, deep down, that if he brought Grace into his family's circle, the attacks wouldn't come openly. They'd come in smiles too sharp, compliments too cold, subtle dismissals, empty invitations, exclusion dressed as etiquette. And that's why he kept their love in the shadows. Not because he was ashamed of her, but because he was terrified of what the world would do to her. He couldn't bear to see her heart bruised by those who only saw status. So he delayed, postponed dinners, made excuses when his mother visited town, avoided questions from family friends, and Grace, with all her gentleness, began to notice. She wasn't naive. She could see it in the flicker of his eyes when someone asked if he was seeing anyone. She heard it in the careful way he changed subjects. She felt it in the pauses. One evening, they sat on a bench near the river. The wind was soft, the water slow. She looked at him, really looked. "Henry," she whispered, "are you proud to love me?" The question hit like thunder in the quiet night. Henry turned to her, eyes wide. He reached for her hands, cold from the evening air, and pressed them to his lips. "Grace, I've never been prouder of anything in my entire life." She didn't look away. "Then why does it feel like I'm a secret?" His jaw tightened. "Because I may lose everything if they find out." She blinked, once, twice. "Then don't risk it," she said quietly. "I don't want to be the reason you lose your life." But she was wrong, because she was his life. Henry couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake, watching shadows dance across his ceiling. He thought of the house he'd grown up in, marble floors, gold-framed portraits, servants who never smiled. He thought of the echo in the hallways, of how his father only praised him in public, of how his mother once told him, "Don't ever choose love over legacy. Love fades. Legacy remains." But Grace's love hadn't faded. It had built a home inside him, quiet, unshakable, warm. The next day his mother called. "You're needed in New York. Board meeting. And the Whitmore girl will be there." He knew what that meant. The Whitmore girl was a senator's daughter. Beautiful, polished, blonde. The kind of woman his parents wanted him to marry. The kind who'd never set foot in a small-town library. Henry stared at his phone long after the call ended. He looked around the clinic he'd built, still unfinished. Looked at the small photograph of Grace he'd secretly taken, now tucked inside a medical journal. He couldn't do it. He couldn't pretend anymore. That evening he showed up at the library after closing. Grace was shelving books in the poetry aisle. She turned, surprised. "You're early. I thought you had that call." He didn't answer with words. He crossed the room in 3 slow steps, cupped her face gently in his hands, and kissed her. It wasn't a grand kiss. No music, no dramatic speeches. Just a kiss that said, "I choose you." When he pulled away, she looked up at him, breathless. "Henry?" "I don't care what they think," he said, voice rough with truth. "I don't care what I lose. My world was nothing until you walked into it." Tears welled in her eyes. "But they'll say what they want. Let them. They don't know what love means. You do." That night they sat by the fire in her cottage, her head resting on his shoulder. The storm wasn't gone, but for the first time, they weren't running from it. They were facing it, together. And Henry finally realized some things were worth losing everything for, because real love doesn't ask for permission. It asks for courage, and he had never felt braver in his life. The morning Henry Westfield walked away from everything was quiet. No headlines, no send-off, no applause. Just the sound of his shoes echoing down the cold marble hallway of the Westfield estate for the last time. He had packed light, a single worn suitcase, a letter folded 3 times, left on his father's desk, and a photograph of Grace pressed between the pages of a roomy poetry book she once lent him. In the letter, he didn't explain. He didn't justify. He simply wrote, "I am choosing a life that finally feels like mine, not bought, not built for me, but chosen. Tell the world what you want. I'm done living for it." He left behind a future most people would call a dream. A leadership role at the Westfield Heart Institute, the penthouse with a skyline view, shares in the family's foundation, his name on hospital wings and charity galas, all gone, because she was worth more. Grace never knew how many nights he'd stayed awake wrestling with the choice. She never saw the storm inside him, the boy who was raised with gold in his hands but always felt cold. But that morning, as he drove back toward Elmridge, a lightness settled in his chest. The kind of peace that comes not from safety, but from surrender. He was finally free. Henry used the last of his personal savings, not tied to the Westfield Trust, to purchase a small, weathered brick building just blocks from the library. It had once been a bakery. Now it would become a modest heart clinic. Not glamorous, not high-tech, but real. He painted the walls himself, hung art Grace had picked from local fairs, stocked the shelves with medical journals, and above the door, he nailed a small wooden sign. Westfield Heart and Healing. He told no one in the city, did no interviews, refused to have his name in the paper. He simply opened the doors and the people came. Locals who couldn't afford big hospitals, veterans, elderly couples, children with nervous mothers. He greeted each one with the same calm, kind smile. They didn't care about his last name. They just cared that he listened, that he treated them with dignity. Meanwhile, Grace continued at the library. Every morning she passed by the clinic windows, and every morning her heart fluttered. Because inside she saw a man choosing her, not with words, but with his life. They continued their evening walks, their bench talks. They didn't talk about the money he left behind or the calls he ignored. They just held each other's hands and knew this was real. Then came that one evening. Winter had softened, the snow was melting. Grace was closing up the library, humming softly as she shelved a book of Keats. She turned, and there he was, standing in the reading room, where it had all begun. In his hand, a single wildflower. Delicate, unassuming, beautiful, like her. Grace blinked, her throat tightening. "Henry," she whispered. He stepped forward, eyes never leaving hers. No grand speech, no audience, just them. He slowly knelt down, right beside the table where they had first talked about stardust and poetry. And then he pulled out a simple rose gold ring, modest, timeless, perfect. He looked up, voice steady, heart raw. "Grace," he said, "you are worth more than any life I was born into. More than the name I left behind. More than every hospital wing, every title, every dollar." Her eyes were already glassy with tears. "I thought I needed to be someone powerful to be loved," he continued. "But I only found love when I finally stopped performing, when I found you." He took her hand. "Marry me, Grace, not because the world will celebrate us, but because this love, our love, is the only thing that's ever made sense." Tears rolled down her cheeks. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, voice trembling, and then louder. "Yes." She knelt down too, laughing through tears, and threw her arms around him. Books surrounded them. Dust floated in the golden light of the stained glass windows. And somewhere in that stillness, the universe seemed to pause, as if even it wanted to witness this quiet miracle. They stayed there for a while. No rush, no noise. Just two souls finally whole. When they stood, Henry slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Grace looked down at the wildflower still tucked between their palms. She didn't see wealth. She didn't see sacrifice. She saw love chosen on purpose. And in that moment, they both knew. They hadn't lost anything. They'd found everything. Together. They married in the garden behind the library. No grand guests, no headlines, no orchestra. Just the two of them, standing beneath the maple tree, reading vows they wrote from the heart. Henry whispered in her ear, "You gave me a new heart, and I'm the heart surgeon." They smiled, kissed, and began their quiet forever. Together they built a life far from wealth, but rich in laughter, late-night stories, and hand-in-hand healing. This is not a story about approval, not about what the world thinks. It's about two people who saw each other's souls in a world full of noise. In a society that often values race, class, and image more than kindness, this story reminds us love is the great equalizer. Real love needs no permission. It doesn't ask for background checks. It asks only for courage.